still check the app sometimes. Not to use it, just to scroll through the profiles of the people I've already blocked. Waiting for the one that says account deleted. It never does. What if I told you the most unsettling thing about online dating isn't being ghosted or catfished, but finding someone who is exactly who they say they are, and realizing they are fundamentally wrong? That's what happened with Ryan from New Jersey, a guy whose profile promised a simple, low-key evening, but whose eyes, when I finally met them, seemed to hold a flicker of perpetual, internal darkness. I went to his place in a brownstone near Hoboken, convinced it would be a harmless evening. It wasn't the guy I should have been worried about. It was the apartment itself. Ryan lived on the 4th floor of a building that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 1950s. The air inside was thick and stale, smelling faintly of old wood and something metallic, like pennies. He was exactly his photo stall, kind of quiet and nervously polite. He told me he was a graphic designer and had only been in the apartment for about 3 weeks. We settled onto his worn olive green couch. The place was almost entirely bare. A few boxes were stacked against one wall, and the only piece of art was a strange, abstract painting of overlapping black and gray shapes that seemed to twist in the periphery. But the real issue wasn't the decor, it was the quiet. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, suffocating silence that made the small sounds of us shifting on the couch seem deafening. When I asked about the bareness, Ryan just shrugged, a fleeting look of discomfort crossing his face. "Haven't finished unpacking," he mumbled. "It's a weird place, though. The landlord, Mr. Thorne, is a little particular." That was the first seed of wrongness, the faint, chemical scent of unease I almost dismissed as new date nerves. The evening progressed awkwardly. We tried watching a movie, but the atmosphere was too distracting. Every 10 minutes or so, I'd feel a strange, cold draft despite the windows being shut. Then, the rhythmic sound started, not loud, but persistent. Scrape, scrape, scrape. It was coming from the floor directly above us. I looked at Ryan. He was staring intently at the TV, his jaw tight. I asked him, "What is that?" He paused the movie, a nervous, almost pained smile on his face. "Oh, that? Yeah, it's the upstairs neighbor. They're very active. Don't worry about it." But it wasn't foot traffic or talking. It was an unnatural, dragging sound, slow and deliberate, like something heavy being pulled across bare floorboards. It would stop for a minute, then begin again, always moving from one side of the room to the other. A little later, while Ryan was in the tiny kitchen getting us water, the sound changed. It became a low, persistent thump-thump, like a fist lightly but constantly knocking on the ceiling, right above the spot where I was sitting. It lasted for a full minute, and as soon as Ryan re-entered the living room, it abruptly stopped. When I told him, he looked sick. He told me a story about how Mr. Thorne had warned him the previous tenant of 5B had been eccentric and sometimes left things behind. But he spoke with the strained confidence of a man lying to himself more than to me. I tried to ignore it, trying to salvage the date, but the air was getting colder. I had a clear view of the dark, narrow hallway that led to the bathroom and bedroom. As I was mid-sentence, talking about my job, I saw it, a shadow. It was tall and impossibly thin, stretched out against the hallway wall, cast from some light source I couldn't see. It moved, just a slight, fluid shift, but it didn't match Ryan's shadow or mine. I froze. Ryan was still talking, oblivious. I kept my eyes fixed on the hall. The shadow solidified, becoming a silhouette of a person standing just around the corner, staring at the living room. It was unnaturally still. The silence from upstairs was back, but now the silence in Ryan's apartment felt aggressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. I finally interrupted him, my voice a whisper. "Ryan, is someone else here?" He followed my gaze to the dark hall. He went pale. "No," he breathed. "I swear. I live alone," Thorne said. He trailed off, his eyes wide. The shadowy figure shifted again, a slow, deliberate movement that made it look like it was leaning into the room, and I could swear I heard the faintest, dry sound, like whispering paper, coming from the corner. It wasn't a shadow of a person. It was the shape of one, but it seemed to drink all the light around it, making the air in the hall look visibly darker. Ryan was finally terrified. He didn't try to explain or rationalize. He just grabbed my arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and said, "We need to go. Now." We scrambled for the door, not even bothering to grab my jacket. As we were fumbling with the deadbolt, the air pressure in the small apartment dropped suddenly, popping my ears. The sound of the drag, the constant, slow scrape from upstairs, returned, but this time it was loud, immediately above us, and it was followed by a wet, heavy thud. Then, a single, clear sound echoed from the dark hallway behind us, the sound of a key being gently inserted into the door of Ryan's bedroom. We didn't wait. We flung the front door open, stumbling out onto the landing and down the concrete stairs, not slowing until we hit the street. Ryan didn't look back. He never contacted me again. I didn't try to contact him. The next morning I drove back to Hoboken to pick up my jacket. The door to 4 Bites was slightly ajar. I pushed it open just enough to see inside. The living room was empty. No couch, no boxers, no strange painting. It was completely stripped down to the bare, dusty floorboards. The only sign that anyone had ever lived there was a small, neat pile of dark, metallic pennies sitting exactly where the corner of the rug had been. The apartment above 5B had no tenant and no history of anyone living there for over a decade. I looked up Ryan's profile a week later. It was gone. Not blocked, not deleted, just gone, like he'd never existed, leaving only the chilling, unsolved mystery of what Ryan had truly brought me to that night, and who, or what, had always been waiting for him there. The warning signs are always there, aren't they? They're always subtle, wrapped up in politeness or a bad connection. For me, the first sign was Chris's profile. It was too perfect. He was a wildlife photographer from rural Montana, the rugged, good-looking type who only used landscape shots for his pictures. Never a clear close-up of his face, which I found intriguing. He messaged immediately after we matched, bypassing the small talk. He suggested a secluded cabin he owned, a few hours outside Missoula, saying the city was too loud for him. He offered to cook me dinner. I rationalized my decision to drive out there as adventurous. That was the real mistake. It wasn't the man I should have been scrutinizing. It was the chilling blankness of the place he insisted on calling home. The cabin was deep in the woods, down a winding gravel road that felt endless. The structure itself was beautiful, dark, polished wood, and huge windows overlooking the dense pines. Chris, finally seeing him in person, was handsome, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. They were a watery blue, and he had an unsettling stillness about him. The cabin's interior was immaculate, almost surgically so. Everything was either a neutral gray or black, but the most striking thing was the absolute lack of personalization. There were no books, no stray papers, no coats draped over a chair, and critically, for a photographer, there wasn't a single photograph on any wall or surface. When I pointed this out, making a joke about a minimalist aesthetic, his smile disappeared. He looked down and just said, "I travel light. Things get lost." It was a hollow explanation that planted the second seed of dread, a chilling sense that this place was merely a stage, set up for a brief, temporary performance. The evening began with Chris pouring expensive wine and cooking. He was charming, talking about the isolation and the peace of the woods. But every topic we touched upon seemed to die quickly. He never elaborated on his family, his past, or his travels beyond vague generalizations. His answers were always clipped, definitive, and strangely emotionless. Then the incident started. I excused myself to use the bathroom, which was tucked into a dark hallway. As I opened the door, I caught a glimpse of something on the floor in the corner of the hallway, a dark, damp footprint. It wasn't shaped like a boot or a shoe. It was wider than a human foot, and the 3 toes were unnaturally long, like talons. I blinked, and the shadow of the hallway seemed to absorb it, making it vanish. I convinced myself the wine was playing tricks on me. When I came back out, Chris was standing stock still in the middle of the living room, staring out the vast picture window into the black woods. And he didn't react until I was right next to him. He turned, his face expressionless, and for a split second, I didn't recognize him. It was like the life had been momentarily sucked out of him. Later, while we were sitting by the fireplace, the true auditory terror began. It was a sound from outside, deep in the tree line, a sound that wasn't quite a howl. Not exactly a moan, but something in between, a strained, wet vocalization, like a creature in agony trying to form words. It was distant, but it cut through the silence of the woods like a knife. Chris reacted instantly. He froze, his head cocked, listening with an intensity that suggested immediate recognition. "What was that?" I whispered, my blood turning to ice. He refused to look at me. "Just a coyote. They get restless this time of year," he said, but his voice was thin and shaky, devoid of conviction. The sound returned, closer this time, and it was undeniably repeating a rhythmic pattern, 3 short, rising cries followed by a single, drawn-out groan. It sounded like something attempting to mimic distress. Then, Chris got up and without a word, walked over to a steel cabinet hidden in the shadows near the kitchen. He opened it, revealing not plates or pantry items, but a collection of heavy-duty locks, chains, and a massive dull silver bolt-action rifle. He didn't take anything out, he just stood there, looking at them. His back to me, the silence that followed was broken by a new, horrifying sound. It wasn't outside, it was coming from under the house. A low, grinding sound, accompanied by a faint, chemical smell like bleach mixed with iron, that began to fill the room. The grinding seemed to move, slow and heavy, right underneath the wooden floorboards where I was sitting. It was then I noticed Chris wasn't looking out the main window anymore. He was looking at the single, small, reinforced window in the pantry area, a window far too high and small to see out of. I followed his gaze, and pressed against the exterior glass, lit dimly by the interior light, was a pale, long hand. It was too large to be a woman's and too slender to be a man's, with fingers that seemed to have one too many joints. It didn't tap or knock. It just pressed flat against the glass, and for a chilling moment, the fingers seemed to slowly flex, dragging moisture down the pane. Chris slammed the cabinet shut, his eyes finally locking onto mine, and they were no longer vague. They were filled with a desperate, animal fear. "Go," he choked out, pushing me toward the front door. "Don't look back. Don't stop driving. Don't say anything to anyone." I didn't need to be told twice. I sprinted to my car, fumbling the key into the ignition. As I turned the car around on the gravel, my headlights briefly swept across the back of the cabin. That's when I saw the foundation. The cabin was built on tall stone pillars, and in the small, deep shadow of the crawl space, I saw a movement. It was a person, or something the size of one, low to the ground, pulling themselves quickly and fluidly on their stomach, dragging something heavy and indistinct behind them into the shadows. I drove until the gravel road turned to asphalt, and then until the sun was up. I never heard from Chris again. His Tinder profile vanished the following day. I contacted the local sheriff's department in Missoula about the area, claiming I was house hunting, and they told me that particular cabin had been the site of a single, highly publicized disappearance 5 years prior, an event the owner had been desperate to erase from local memory. I never figured out what was under the house, or what Chris was photographing, or if he was simply trying to keep me away from whatever it was that demanded a life lived with no pictures and a silent, terrifying devotion. I only know I saw what he was running from, and whatever it was, it had learned to use a phone. It started with a perfectly normal message. "Hey, saw your profile. You like obscure indie films too?" That was Marc. His profile picture was friendly, unassuming, a casual selfie in front of a bookstore in Brooklyn. We chatted for a few days, seemed to hit it off, and eventually, he invited me over to his place in a pre-war building in Astoria, Queens, for a movie night. It was supposed to be a cozy, no-pressure first date. Instead, it became an education in how silence can be weaponized, and how some apartments, like some people, are not just empty, but deliberately hollowed out. I should have paid more attention to the lingering feeling of being watched, not by Marc, but by the very walls of his apartment. Marc's building was old, with a creaky elevator that smelled of dust and forgotten meals. His apartment, 7C, was small, but tastefully furnished a comfortable couch, a decent TV, a small dining table. Standard, New York living. Marc himself was exactly as he appeared in his photos, pleasant, a little shy, with kind eyes. We ordered pizza, put on a movie, and settled in. Everything felt normal, comfortable, almost boring. But after about an hour, the first anomaly appeared, a faint, almost imperceptible echo. It wasn't the kind you get in an empty room. It was like my own voice, or Marc's, had a tiny, delayed shadow. If I cleared my throat, I'd hear a faint, distant hum from somewhere within the apartment, just a fraction of a second later. I dismissed it as old building quirks. Yet, a subtle seed of unease was planted. A quiet hum in the back of my mind that whispered, "Something here is off-kilter." The movie played, and as the evening darkened, the apartment seemed to grow heavier. Marc wasn't a big talker, which at first I attributed to shyness, but his silences were deep, profound, sometimes lasting minutes. Even when I asked a direct question, he would just stare past me, his expression blank, before snapping back and giving a short, generic answer. Then the echoing became more pronounced. It wasn't just our voices now. When a character on screen would utter a sharp word, I'd hear a tsk or a clack from somewhere near the back of the apartment, a faint but distinct replica. When I mentioned it, Marc gave a tight, almost forced laugh. Thin walls, I guess. My neighbors are always busy, but the sounds weren't coming from the sides. They seemed to emanate from within his apartment itself, specifically from a closed, unmarked door at the very end of a short, dark hallway near the kitchen, a door that looked suspiciously like it led to a second bedroom. As the night wore on, the apartment got colder, despite the heat being on. I could feel a constant, subtle draft, not from a window, but from that back hallway. The echoes escalated from faint imitations to distinct, chilling repetitions. I dropped my fork on the hardwood floor with a sharp clink. Almost immediately, a dull, metallic clank came from behind that door. It was no longer subtle. Marc, sitting next to me, seemed oblivious, engrossed in the movie, though I noticed his shoulders were strangely tense, almost hunched. A few minutes later, the movie had a jump scare, and I involuntarily let out a small, sharp gasp. From behind the door, a split second later, came an identical, sharp intake of breath, a soft, wet hiss that sent shivers down my spine. I looked at Marc. His eyes were wide, fixed on the screen, but his hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles were white. He was definitely hearing it. He was choosing to ignore it. The atmosphere wasn't just cold. It was thick, charged with a silent, unseen presence. It felt like something was mimicking us, just out of sight, and learning. Suddenly, the electricity flickered, plunging the apartment into near darkness before returning a second later. In that brief moment of pitch black, a new sound cut through the silence, a series of rapid, desperate scratches against the inside of that closed back door. They were frantic, like an animal trapped, trying to claw its way out. Marc jumped, finally breaking his composure. He looked at the door, then at me, his face a mask of terror. I think you should go," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. Before I could even respond, the scratching stopped. It was replaced by something far worse. A slow, deliberate thud, 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 coming from directly behind the door, moving slowly from one side of the room to the other. It sounded like something, heavy and soft, being dragged across a carpeted floor. Then, from the very bottom of the door, just above the floorboards, a thin, sickly yellow liquid began to seep out, slowly forming a small puddle on the dark wood. It smelled faintly of cleaning solution and something metallic, like stale blood. I didn't wait for an explanation. I grabbed my bag and stumbled for the front door, my heart pounding. Marc didn't try to stop me. He just sat frozen on the couch, staring at the spreading yellow stain, his face utterly devoid of hope. As I wrestled with the lock, I heard it one last time. Not an echo, but a new, clear sound from behind that door. A low, guttural giggle, not quite human, followed by the distinct schlick of a deadbolt sliding into place from the inside. The apartment's front door finally opened, and I fled down the hall, hearing Marc's strained, broken voice from inside. "No, don't please," as the door to apartment 7C, slowly, silently, swung shut behind me. I moved out of Astoria a month later. I never saw Marc or his profile again. I looked up his building online, searched for news, but found nothing. There was no record of a second tenant in 7C, nor any reports of disturbances. I still, occasionally, hear a faint echo of my own voice when I'm alone in a quiet room. A chilling reminder of the presence that was so carefully hidden, yet so desperately trying to break free. Marc wasn't just lonely. He was a gatekeeper, and whatever was behind that door wasn't just echoing his life, it was trying to take it.